action to protect U.S. Embassy personnel and their families and issue visa restrictions on Nicaraguan government officials. The Treasury Department also recently announced sanctions against 3 top Ortega officials for human rights abuses and corruption. I strongly applaud all these actions, but I want to note my concern over an Organization of American States, OAS, resolution jointly introduced by the United States and Nicaragua that seemed to downplay the crisis and deaths and could have been more strongly supported the democratic actors on the ground. The U.S. must do more. I urge the State Department and the Treasury Department to issue additional visa restrictions and Magnitsky sanctions on Ortega regime officials to send a clear message that the United States will not allow government officials who exploit the Nicaraguan people or who commit human rights abuses to visit U.S. destinations or access the U.S. banking systems. Excuse me. The U.S. must also do more to support the democratic actors in Nicaragua. Also, U.S. funding to support the Nicaraguan people is strongly recommended by the subcommittee. It is essential the U.S. respond to the crisis with a clear strategy and that we consider the needs of the actors on the ground and their capacity to manage money effectively to achieve results as we consider any additional funding. Finally, I strongly believe that the U.S. will be most effective when we work together to support the Nicaraguan people through not only the Organization of American States and its member states, but also with the European Union, Canada, and the Lima Group countries to coordinate a united response to the Nicaraguan crisis. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the Trump administration is engaging with all these different actors to support the Nicaraguan people. And with that, I turn to our ranking member, Cyrus, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding such a timely hearing. And thank you to our witnesses for being here. But before I begin, I also like to recognize Berta Valle. Thank you for being here. It's, I wish your husband well. I hope he's speedy recovery, and tell him that we appreciate his courage and his determination. So thank you for being here. You know, as we know, Nicaragua is currently in the throes of a civil conflict as Ortega's government continues to oppress its citizens for pursuing greater democratic rights. Since Ortega came to power, he has gradually consolidated power in the hands of his family and his cronies at the expense of the Nicaraguan citizens. The peaceful protests that began in April initially opposed the proposed government's reform to Social Security. However, as violent attempts by government security forces to quash the protests failed, the demonstration gradually became a call for a more democratic Nicaragua. The Catholic Church attempted numerous times to mediate dialogue between Ortega and the opposition groups, but Ortega's regime has repeatedly failed to uphold its end of the agreement. Over the course of the last several months, as negotiations over dialogue has devolved, hundreds of Nicaragua citizens are estimated to have been killed, with thousands more injured. Recently, international observers from the International Commission of Human Rights, the United Nations Commission of Human Rights, and European Unions have finally arrived in Nicaragua to begin investigating the violence despite Ortega's reluctance. Now, many Nicaraguans are demanding political reforms and the resignation of Ortega and his wife before the scheduled elections in 2021. The United States cannot stand idly by and ignore the demands of the Nicaraguan people, while the Ortegas and his confidants push the country undoubtedly towards a civil war. That is why my colleagues, Representative Roth-Layton, Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Cook, and I have introduced a bipartisan resolution condemning the ongoing violence in Nicaragua and urging the administration to impose sanctions on individuals who qualify under the Global Magnitsky Act. I have also worked with my friend Deanna Ross-Layton to pass the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act to hold the regime accountable for its misuse of international loans. This bill will direct the U.S. to not support international loans to Nicaragua until the government increases transparency and has free and fair elections. Unified pushback from the international community shows the courageous Nicaraguans on the ground, that the world stands shoulder to shoulder with them. It is the only way to help Ortega see the writing on the wall. He has to give up his grip and enact the long overdue and meaningful political reforms people are fighting for. I am eager to hear from the administration's view the potential outcomes of the Nicaraguan crisis and look forward to hearing how they plan on standing up for the protesters and promote democratic reforms in Nicaragua moving forward. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Thank you very much. My able staff always passes me notes here, and I didn't have my right glasses on. I thought it said IRS, and I said I paid my taxes, but it was to remind me that Elena Ross-Layton is going to make an opening statement. So, Ms. IRS, you're up.
I've been called worse, but that's pretty low. But thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Ranking Member Sears for putting together this very important hearing as the Nicaraguan people march through the streets today on a national strike to demand Ortega's exit from power. And like Albio Sears, I also have a wonderful constituent, Nora Sandigo, who's there in the audience. Nora, please stand up, and she's been such a valiant fighter for the people of Nicaragua and all Central America. Muchas gracias, Nora. And I especially want to commend the wonderful work that USAID Administrator Green, who's a dear friend of this subcommittee, for what he's been doing to assist the people of Nicaragua and Venezuela. I have to say that I'm relieved that this administration, unlike the previous administration, is paying close attention to the Western Hemisphere and has shown a willingness to lead on many fronts, including Ortega's escalating repression in Nicaragua. I've already led 2 letters urging sanctions on Ortega's cronies for their roles in corruption and human rights violations against the Nicaraguan people, and the administration has responded by including all of these individuals on the global Magnitsky list. That we should build on that list, which is why I intend to send another letter in the near future with all of our colleagues here, because we know that these despots will do anything to cling to power, and they only respond to pressure. Ortega is the sole individual responsible for the ongoing violence and the rising death toll in Nicaragua today, but it's not something that just happened overnight. It's not like we didn't know what to expect when Ortega reclaimed power in Nicaragua. I came to Congress in 1989, and at that time, democracy was sort of looming in Nicaragua after Ortega's first reign of terror, which took the lives of over 100,000 Nicaraguans. Due to his repression, thousands of Nicaraguans had already fled their native homeland to seek refuge in our great country, and we're so proud in South Florida to have a growing Nicaraguan American community. And as a political refugee myself, just like Mr. Albio Sears, we fled Castro's grip on power in our native homeland of Cuba, so we can relate to the hardships that the Nicaraguan people faced in a new country. So that's why, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, it pains me so much to see Nicaragua go down this path again. He's pulled off many tricks to position himself in the place he is now with the help of his wife and so-called Vice President Rosario, and you know she's wicked. He's bad, and she's a great partner in terror. He's been able to systematically weaken and dismantle democratic institutions in Nicaragua. What a pair. He and his family control every institution, every aspect of the country. He's co-opted and coerced the private sector. He's unleashed his thugs to violently crush any and all dissent, all of which has caused angst, frustration, despair among the Nicaraguan people. And that brings us to the tragic situation that we have today. In April, the Nicaraguan people said, basta ya, enough is enough, took to the streets in opposition to Ortega and his corrupt policies. And in just 2 short months, almost 400 Nicaraguans' lives and the life of at least 1 U.S. citizen have been taken at the bloody hands of the murderous Ortega regime. Thousands of people have been injured, hundreds mysteriously disappeared, while hundreds of thousands from all ages and all socioeconomic backgrounds continue to be intimidated, repressed, and threatened on a daily basis. The violence is escalating, and the advanced technical weapons being used, it's alarming. Ortega has doubled down on his repressive tactics. In just this week, he has ruled out early elections, sent henchmen to fire shots near the residence of the U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua. Just this week, killed more than 30 people, sent more of his mobs to physically attack priests and ransack churches. These are not the actions of someone who wants to work in good faith to reach a peaceful resolution. These are not the actions of someone who truly wants a national dialogue. These are the actions of a thug who wants to stay in power no matter what the cost. And to that end, Ortega has expanded his cooperations with regimes across the region and beyond. Just last week, several reports indicated that Maduro had sent a shipment of weapons to Ortega, and there are reports that suggest that the Cubans have shipped in their military personnel and snipers to Nicaragua as well. And we've known for years about Ortega's coziness with Putin. So there's a lot of alarming trends, Mr. Chairman, none of them good. But at least the people of Nicaragua know where the U.S. stands, and we stand with the people of Nicaragua. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Ms. IRS. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, I'm going to explain the lighting system in front of you. You will each have 5 minutes to present your oral statement. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow. And when your time is expired, the light will turn red. I ask that you conclude your testimony. Once the red light comes on, I will gently tap. Sometimes I come down hard. I haven't got the right glasses, and I might hit my colleague to the right by mistake. After our witnesses testify, members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity to ask questions. Our first witness to testify will be Ambassador Carlos Trujillo, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States, OAS. Prior to this, the ambassador served as a state representative in the Florida House, special advisor at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, assistant state attorney in Miami, and has been a member of 3 real estate holding companies in Florida. He earned a BS in Business Administration from Spring Hill College and a JD from Florida State College of Law. Our second witness is Ambassador Michael Kozak, a senior advisor and senior bureau official in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. Prior to this, the ambassador served in numerous senior positions in the executive branch, including Senior Director on the National Security Council, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador in Minsk, U.S. Negotiator with Cuba, Special Presidential Envoy to negotiate the departure of General Oriega, Assistant Negotiator for the Panama Canal Treaties, and staff of the Middle East Peace Negotiator. He earned his JD and BA from the University of California at Berkeley. Our last witness to testify will be Ms. Barbara Feinstein, the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Latin America and Caribbean at the U.S. Agency for International Aid, USAID. Prior to this, Ms. Feinstein served as USAID's Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Legislative Affairs in the Office of USAID Administrator, on the professional staff of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations and the House International Relations. She has also served in various capacities at the Department of State and Defense. She earned a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's from Princeton University. Just like to mention the staff. Obviously, Berkeley is, what about my alma mater?
Which one?
No, I won't tell you. I don't want to embarrass my alma mater for graduating me. Ambassador Trujillo, you are recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Series, members of the subcommittee, thank you for conducting this hearing and for allowing me the opportunity to come before you to address the most urgent matter and the critical need to work together to uphold freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights for the people of Nicaragua. On June 4th, at the 48th regular session of the General Assembly of the Organization of American States, Secretary Pompeo underscored that we join with the nations around the world in demanding that the Ortega government respond to the Nicaraguan people's demand for democratic reform and hold accountable those responsible for violence. The Secretary's remarks echoed those of Vice President Pence during the May 7 visit to the OAS headquarters, in which he also stressed the United States will continue to stand with all Nicaraguans peacefully exercising their fundamental freedoms in the face of tremendous repression and the will to continue to press for democracy and accountability in Nicaragua. Let me begin today by underscoring that the United States condemns the Nicaraguan government's ongoing violence and intimidation campaign against its own citizens, and more recently, church officials. The United States is under no illusion as to who's responsible for this violence. The United States condemns the attacks in Deriamba and surrounding areas over the last several days, including the heavy-handed tactics against the mediators of the national dialogue, such as Cardinal Brenes, who recently returned from Rome. The United States has backed up our words of condemnation with actions. Last week, we announced the designation of 3 Nicaraguan officials for human rights abuses and corruptions under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. The strategic designation targeted those who gave shoot-to-kill orders that have resulted in the deaths of Nicaraguans who are exercising their constitutional rights to oppose their government. The designations also targeted facilitators of those who strive to enrich themselves off of the backs of the Nicaraguan people. These targeted sanctions, plus earlier and continuing visa revocations, show the United States will expose and hold accountable those responsible for Nicaraguan government's ongoing violence and intimidation campaign against its own people. Let me be clear. It is Ortega's government that every day renews its directive to kill its people in order to remain in power. Local human rights groups and international media report that 38 people were killed just between July 8th and July 10th in a government offensive that also injured the church officials. Between April 19th and July 20th, over 300 people have died, more than 2,000 have been injured, and over 200 are still reported missing. Just yesterday, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights briefed the OAS Permanent Council on its ongoing efforts on the ground in Nicaragua and recounted a variety of systematic and disturbing human rights abuses. Furthermore, it again made clear that the Nicaraguan government's responsibility for the ongoing violence and repression. According to the Inter-American Commission, the Nicaraguan NGO Center for Human Rights, and Amnesty International, there's substantial evidence that the government is directing the national police, as well as Sandinista youth and government-controlled gangs, to repress protesters violently. There are credible reports of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearance, and torture in custody. Furthermore, citizens have been unable or unwilling to access health care for their injuries. People have distrusted government-run hospitals that they have reportedly forced families to sign certificates that falsifies the cause of death in order to retrieve the bodies of their deceased loved ones. The United States supports the Commission's new mechanism to investigate human rights abuses and believes strongly that we must hold those accountable for human rights abuses accountable for their actions. We welcome in particular the efforts of the International Interdisciplinary Group of Independent Experts. I am pleased that the group of independent experts is in Nicaragua as we meet today, investigating the ongoing acts of violence taking place in Nicaragua. It is imperative that OAS member and observer states provide the Commission the support necessary to ensure it could carry out its important mission effectively and remain on the ground as long as necessary, while performing its vital work unimpeded by the Nicaraguan government. For its part, the government of Nicaragua had indicated its willingness to cooperate with the Commission's effort, but so far it appeared to have impeded the work of the Commission, and just yesterday rejected the IACHR's finding when presented to the OAS Permanent Council. It is for this reason that the OAS must continue to shine a spotlight on the human rights crisis unfolding before our eyes in Nicaragua and hold the Nicaraguan government accountable. Esteemed members of the subcommittee, let me also be clear that while these mechanisms and visits are a necessary step towards greater accountability and enhanced citizen security, they nonetheless are insufficient to resolve the ongoing crisis of governance and democratic backslide in Nicaragua. The violence and loss of life in Nicaragua reflects the need for urgent democratic reforms now, consistent with the purpose, practice, and principles of the OAS, especially those articulated in the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Simply put, the Nicaraguan people deserve far better from their government. We strongly support the proposal by many sectors of the Nicaraguan societies for free, fair, and early elections with credible domestic and international electoral observations in line with the terms and spirit of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. There is no apparent way to resolve this political crisis. We have urged the OAS Secretary General to promote and support the reform of democratic institutions in Nicaragua, especially the electoral system, who has manipulated by the government in recent years and sparked the Nicaraguan people's demand for fair and transparent process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Kosak, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Series, and members of the subcommittee. It feels like old times. Congresswoman Russ-Leighton and I was acting assistant secretary for WHA the last time we were talking about Daniel Ortega and Nicaragua, and here we go again. Let's hope it turns out the same way. Thank you for holding this timely hearing. On June 14th, Vice President Pence called on Daniel Ortega to end his government's crimes and answer his nation's cry for democracy and human rights. The way to do this is to answer their call for early, free, and fair elections. Our message is simple. Allow the Nicaraguan people to resolve this crisis through democratic means. The continued campaign of violence against protesters is self-defeating. More than 300 people have died since protests started on April 18, and that number is increasing. The reason the Ortega-Murillo regime faces these protests is precisely because they have responded to legitimate grievances with violence. More of the same will not end the crisis. Daniel Ortega should know better than most. This did not work for Somoza. It will not work for him. There is substantial evidence that the government is directing national police, Sandinista youth, and government-controlled gangs to suppress protests violently. There are credible reports of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and torture, and there is evidence of the use of snipers. Citizens have been unable to obtain health care for their injuries. Government-run hospitals have reportedly forced families to sign certificates that falsified the cause of death. This crisis has been years in the making. It is the product of the hollowing out of democratic institutions under Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. Their regime has disregarded the rule of law, basic tenets of democracy, and international commitments to protect human rights. Instead, the family has governed through pacts where they allocated the political and economic spoils of dictatorship with other groups. The ruling party controls the legislative and judicial branches of government. The Ortega-Murillo family controls 8 of the 9 major television stations, and when the violence broke out, the Ortegas ordered 5 independent television stations off the air. Since the 2008 elections, Ortega has consistently blocked opposition party candidates from the ballot. Before the 2016 general elections, Ortega had the Supreme Court disqualify a principal opposition leader, and the Supreme Electoral Council was ordered to remove 16 of 27 opposition members from the National Assembly. The United States has consistently called on the government of Nicaragua to respect peaceful protest, human rights, freedom of expression, and democratic norms. We are pleased that we've been joined by many others in calling out these abuses. A European Union statement condemned the May 30 Mother's Day violence. It urged that the government implement all Inter-American Human Rights Commission recommendations and permit the entry of relevant UN bodies. UN Secretary General Guterres said that it was essential that those responsible for such serious human rights violations are held to account. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has called for the creation of an international commission to investigate the violence. And as OAS Secretary General Almagro indicated yesterday, early, free, and fair elections are imperative if Nicaragua is to solve this crisis. Now, we have called on other elements of the Nicaraguan government who have admirably not involved themselves in these abuses to live up to the Hemisphere's shared commitment to democracy. We admire the many in Nicaraguan public service who do not allow their professional loyalty to be abused by a corrupt family seeking to cling to power through brutal means. As my colleagues have indicated, we have used visa revocations and restrictions under Section 212A3C of the Immigration and Nationality Act to restrict the visas of people who are responsible for these crimes. And we have most recently used Global Magnitsky Act. These are the beginning of an effort to support the efforts of the Nicaraguan people through using the tools that you in Congress have provided us. Those who continue to collaborate with the Ortega-Murillo regime in abusing the human rights of the Nicaraguan people and in preventing them from exercising their democratic rights will find themselves and their families in the same situation as those who've just had their visas and economic activities restricted. But those who respect human rights and democratic institutions have our respect, and more importantly, they have the respect of their own people. This subcommittee is wise to shine a spotlight on this crisis brought about by the insistence of one family in clinging to power through violence. The Nicaraguan people deserve a government that respects their vote and respects human rights. This is why we support the dialogue under the auspices of the Catholic Church, so long as it is aimed at implementing the call for early, free, and fair elections. We will work closely with this committee to support the efforts of the Nicaraguan people to bring about a democratic end to their suffering. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Before I introduce our next speaker, it's somewhat of an anomaly that 2 days in a row we have a witness from USAID, and I am delighted, very impressed with my visit down there and other places. So obviously you have, everybody on the staff loves you, I guess, so I had to throw it. So Ms. Feinstein, you're now recognized. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Siris, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this invitation to testify today and for holding this hearing at such a critical time. On behalf of the United States Agency for International Development, I want to thank the subcommittee for its unyielding commitment to advancing human rights and democracy in our hemisphere and for your support of USAID's work in Nicaragua. As many of you know, the United States is the only remaining donor working on democracy, governance, and human rights in the country, and it is thanks to your support that we have been able to maintain a crucial lifeline for civil society organizations, human rights defenders, emerging leaders, and independent media, all of whom remain under grave attack. At no time has that lifeline been more critical than in the last few months, as the Ortega government has sustained a brutal crackdown against the Nicaraguan people, censoring media and unleashing a reign of terror against any who challenge its repression, including the recent brutal attacks against the clergy, as well as Felix Maradiaga. According to the latest figures, more than 300 people have been killed since the protests began in April 2018, most at the hands of the National Police, pro-government youth groups, and/or parapolice. In early June, I had the privilege of joining Administrator Green in meeting with some of the courageous student leaders, independent journalists, and human rights defenders who came to Washington, D.C. to shine a light on the atrocities underway in their country. We heard firsthand how students are putting their lives on the line to protest injustice, peacefully demand their rights, and condemn the killings, torture, and disappearances of their friends and fellow students. Human rights defenders spoke of jail sentences and other threats that both they and their families are facing, punishment for daring to speak the truth. And journalists shared stories of the perilous environment within which they are operating, some murdered in cold blood for chronicling the government-sanctioned brutality we continue to witness to this day. Administrator Green has added his voice to that of Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo in condemning the atrocities committed by the Ortega regime. USAID commends the bravery of the students, journalists, human rights defenders, civil society, religious leaders, and indigenous groups who have united their voices in a call for justice, rule of law, and a return to democratic order. We also recognize and respect that any meaningful change must be led by the Nicaraguan people themselves. This is their movement, and we will provide appropriate support when requested and warranted. Indeed, as this crisis has unfolded, USAID has provided rapid assistance to scores of civil society groups, human rights organizations, independent media, and others involved in peaceful protest. To ensure reporting of independent and accurate information at a time when government-controlled forces are systematically censoring independent media, either through cyber attacks, destruction of physical infrastructure, online slander campaigns, or unfounded criminal charges, USAID is providing critical assistance to journalists from 14 different independent media outlets. This assistance, which builds upon longer-term efforts to strengthen independent media in the country, is helping to combat disinformation and disprove the distorted narrative promoted by the Ortega government. USAID has also mobilized technical expertise to provide on-the-spot assistance with digital security for USAID partners working in civil society and media who have seen an increase in online attacks, heightened online surveillance, and attempts by the government to take websites offline. To ensure human rights protections, USAID has awarded multiple small grants to Nicaraguan human rights and civil society organizations. These funds are enabling these groups to provide short-term legal aid for those detained, injured, or for the families of those killed in the protests. Our resources are also helping to coordinate and support networks of human rights defenders, to document violations and to elevate cases of human rights abuses to the inter-American and UN systems. USAID continues to recalibrate our approach to assist those in need and to position the agency to respond to opportunities as they emerge. The United States will continue to respond as appropriate, and we express our solidarity with the courageous protesters, journalists, and other democratic actors in civil society seeking a better future for themselves and their family. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for shining a spotlight on this crisis and for your commitment to advancing the freedom and human rights of citizens throughout the hemisphere. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to forego my remarks at the time. I'm very pleased with the number of members that we have here. And we got a busy afternoon, multiple committees, so I'm going to come back later on. But right now, I do want to turn to the ranking member, Sears, for his questions. Well, he was going to go after you. You want to yield to Helen?
You have to go? Go ahead. You can start. I'll go after you.
Thank you very much, Albio.
This is the way everybody should get along.
To New Jerseyans. I am sharing a hearing at 3 o'clock on tuberculosis, so I will have to leave. But I want to thank, first of all, our three highly distinguished witnesses who are incredibly effective, just have done yeoman's work for human rights, and I just want to thank all of you for what you're doing now, particularly during this crisis. I do have just a couple of comments and questions, and I'll be brief. And Ambassador Kozak, as you said, here we go again. It was 36 years ago that I first met with Daniel Ortega in Managua. I went down on a trip. It was Frank Wolf, Tony Hall, Bob McEwen, and I. We met with him and Tomas Borge. It was a contentious set of meetings, and we brought up one issue after another with regards to human rights abuse, the systematic use of torture, and here we go again. So, you know, it's the same person, Comandante Ortega, as he even preferred to be called then. And I guess my first question would be about, and thank you for those 3 designations under the Magnitsky Act. Hopefully there will be more, and I'm sure that's under very active consideration. But, you know, as Mark Green and you, Ambassador Kozak, heard from students just about a month ago, some of those students who got food and sustenance during their crisis with the government got sick, fell ill, because the belief is that they were they ate intentionally tainted food. When Frank Wolf and I and the other 2 met with Daniel Ortega, 3 of us drank the drink that was given to us by Daniel Ortega. 1 did not. Tony Hall did not. He didn't get sick. We got violently ill for about 14 days. Can't say for sure, but what a terrible indicator. And now these wonderful students have gotten sick from that. And if you want to speak to that, because, you know, we know what Cuba has done to our diplomats, you know, these other ways, you know, the billy clubs and the torture and the bullets are one way, and the beatings. Another way is to kill people or hurt them severely through poison. And, of course, what they do in Cuba was outrageous. Secondly, very quickly, the prelates, including the nuncio, who is an ambassador, and certainly when you mistreat an ambassador, that crosses a line internationally. What is being done, if you could speak to that? You know, the church, over and over again, as we all know so well, whether it be in DR Congo, and I'm going there in about a month, we see it in South Sudan. The church steps up. It did it in Nicaragua for so many years under Abande Bravo. My question is, what can be done with regards to our governance accounts to further fortify the church's incredible role in mediating and trying to bring peace and reconciliation? I have many other questions, but again, having been given this opportunity to go first because of my hearing, I'll forego that and submit those questions for the record.
Well, thank you, Mr. Smith. It's a pleasure to see you again. The poisoning issue that you mentioned, unfortunately, I've seen that in too many places that all went to the same spy school, so I don't have anything specific on this one, but it wouldn't surprise me. We've seen it before in too many places. And again, what they're, there just seems to be no respect there for what you do to diplomats but more importantly, what they're doing to their own people. On the nuncio, I think it would be up to the Vatican to make a protest over mistreatment of their envoy. And I think on the final one, and Barbara can talk too, but I think we're in a position to be supportive of mediation efforts, and if we are successful, and we are trying to plan for success here, if we're able to get agreement to an early election, there's a whole string of things that will come with that, observers, both international and domestic, reformation of the electoral machinery, and so on. So I think we're very cognizant of that and trying to set stuff aside. I would make one request to you and the other members of the committee, which is we're getting near the end of the fiscal year, and the gap we always run into is that at the beginning of the year, all money gets frozen, sometimes for like 6 months, while we do all the negotiations. And we may, if we're lucky enough that we're moving on this, we may be coming back to you and saying, can we get an early release of funds next year to try to deal with that? But
thank you so very much.
I
do have other questions, but I'll wait.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ranking Member Sears.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm always amazed at the audacity of these people, like Ortega. He goes and puts his wife as vice president. You have the second poorest country in the region. He goes and buys $80 million worth of tanks from Russia. I assume that he's going to turn those tanks on his people. To me, if anybody continues to deal or work or invest with this Ortega thug, we have to find a way of stopping that, because he's just getting richer and richer and richer. I understand his brothers is rich, his wife is very rich, he's very rich, and I'm concerned that it's going to lead to a civil war in that country again. They went through a civil war once before, which was really devastating to the country. I don't know if they ever have recovered from it. And I'm afraid that the way he's behaving with the support of some of these other countries is going to head that way. So what more pressure can we put on this thug from Nicaragua that we're not doing now? I know that there was $10 million in the budget for Nicaragua. I hope that we don't go through with that. I hope that we can get the NICA bill through the Senate. I think that will send a strong message to the international community not to deal with this thug. So what else can we do as a Congress here? We have a resolution condemning the Ortega regime. Ambassador, can you think of anything else that we can?
Thank you for your question. I think one thing from the multilateral perspective, Representative, having friends and allies also lends support from a financial perspective and also from a diplomatic perspective. Inside of the OAS, we're pursuing a resolution which hopefully we'll take up either tomorrow or the following week. Like all resolutions, it's important for its passage. In order to receive its passage, we need 18 votes. Without revealing our vote count here in public, I will be happy to sit down with you and go with some of the countries that diplomatic pressure would be very, very important in a multilateral setting and getting their support. Getting financial support for the Commission on Human Rights, having as many people as we can on the ground supervising, taking notes of the violations of human rights is also very, very important. To date, the missions run about $1.4 million. The U.S. mission has contributed $500,000 with the willingness to do more. Unfortunately, a lot of other countries have not contributed any resources whatsoever to supporting those efforts. And I think acts like the NICA Act and other bilateral pressure that does exist, the global Magnitsky sanctions, individual visa revocations is something that could take place. I think a variety of not only multilateral but bilateral pressure and that combination and that timing, that systematic approach and that coordination could really lead to create the conditions for true, earnest diplomatic solutions to this problem.
Well, I'll be happy to work with you on any of those, because I just, you know, when you have the killings, and I understand now that they have snipers trying to kill the most active members of these demonstrations, it seems that they're going by the same way Venezuela is going. I think they got the idea from Venezuela, and I wonder where Venezuela got the idea from. So it's really disheartening that they were going on a path that everybody was looking up to Nicaragua, and now we're just taking a step backwards. And sometimes it bothers me that we don't see this coming here in America. I think that we have to really start focusing more on the Western Hemisphere and what is going on in the Western Hemisphere. Because every time we look the other way, Russia seems to be stepping in. You have China to be stepping in, and now we have in places where Iran is starting to set up these schools throughout the Western Hemisphere. And I just worry that we're always a step behind some of these people and some of these countries. I mean, Ortega was known to be a no-good crook for years. And yet we have people investing money with the regime, investing money with the clan from Ortega. It just boggles my mind that we always seem to be a step behind some of the things that go on in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I appreciate the panel being here. I want to build off of what Albio Sierra says, and I agree with his sentiment that the Western Hemisphere, the democracy is falling down. And Ms. Feinstein, I'd like to have from you, what do we need to do different? I mean, we've invested $194 million in 10 years in Nicaragua, and a lot of that goes to good governance. It's obviously not working. What is the major impediment that you run into when we're spending the American taxpayers' money on what we claim to be democracy? What they're doing is nothing near a democracy. I want to know, what do we have to do on the ground different?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think ultimately the solution to what happens in Nicaragua, as has been the case and will be the case going forward and to this point, rests with the people of Nicaragua, including the government of Nicaragua. And I think that the situation that we are seeing today is a product of actions taken by Daniel Ortega, by Rosario Murillo, and the very actions that we're responding right now, it's very clear that the responsibility lies with them.
Okay, let me interrupt you there.
Yes.
The actions, because we agree, Ortega's a bad player, and the people can't respond because of the form of government he has. When did we see this starting to deteriorate, and could we have intervened earlier or done something different, putting more pressure on the Ortega government, gone in there, maybe pulled back trade or pulled back support earlier on?
So I think I defer to my colleagues in terms of diplomatic initiatives. I would say, broadly speaking, at this moment in time, and this is also to the ranking member's question, I think there's an important role that other countries in the region can also play, and I think that Congress can have a very important role in leaning on other actors, including in Central America and Mexico in the region, since instability in this country is not in their interest, in addition to the economic implications. I would say at this very point in time, we are well positioned since we have been a lifeline to civil society in Nicaragua. We have been the only actor in the space in recent history, which has allowed us to undertake interventions in 4 key areas: in human rights, independent media, legal assistance, and digital security, which are keeping people alive, allowing them to document human rights violations. And going forward, as hopefully a greater accountability can be brought to bear, whether it's within Nicaragua, ideally one day, but certainly in inter-American fora, in international fora, the kind of documentation that's taking place on the ground right now will be absolutely essential to that.
I agree with all of what you're saying, and we're documenting that, but yet it's de-escalate. I mean, it's getting worse, the whole situation, and it's not just Nicaragua, it's Honduras, it's all these other countries. There's got to be a different, there's got to be a paradigm shift. We have got to do something different, and we can work with civil society, but if you've got a corrupt government, it's not going to change. What do we have to do? I mean, we can empower. The only way I can see it happening is empowering the people to change government, because empowered people can change government. But if they don't have the If they don't have the rule of law and the honoring of human rights, you're never going to have it. They'll tolerate it, the dictators, the Ortegas of the world, they'll tolerate a certain amount of human rights. We come in there and we demand these things, and they'll tolerate us with a little bit of that, but they're doing a whole lot of corruption and a decay of what we believe as democracy, the best way to live in the world, free people. Is there anything else? I mean, where do you begin? I mean, without changing governments or the people in there, and certainly we've been down that road and we don't want to do that. What about having a coalition of other governments, the OAS, to have them come in there and put more pressure on them as an organization, or are they as inept as the UN? Does anybody want to?
Yeah, I think Congressman, the OAS from a multilateral perspective could put multilateral pressure with some of the other countries, but sometimes I don't feel like that's even enough. I think if the real problem here is corruption, we need to attack the individual corrupt actors. Congress, the U.S. government has multiple tools in order to attack these individual corrupt actors. Once you show that these actors don't have impunity before the law, they have to move those assets, whether it's in country.
We've been talking about this for 20, 30 years, but we're not getting the results. So what was your suggestion on how do you hold them accountable? Who's going to hold them accountable besides
So I think the Global Magnitsky Act hold those three people accountable, but we know that they're not the only ones. There's other people who are stealing and looting the riches of the Nicaraguan people. They need to be held accountable. The banks that do business with these individuals need to be held accountable. These individuals have the impunity of being able to travel to the United States. Their visas should be held accountable.
I've got to cut you off because I'm out of time, and I thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now I'll recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espiat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member. Just in a few weeks, our president will be meeting with Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has long sought to deepen ties with allies that share a resentment of the U.S. leadership, both locally in the Western Hemisphere as well as across the world. With Nicaragua and Russia increasingly deepening their relationship, and Russian weapons being used by the Ortega regime against opposition demonstrators, as was previously stated by one of my colleagues, Russian tanks were bought. What are we doing to help our country? What are we doing to help resolve this situation? If we have a hunky-dory relationship with one of the main actors disturbing and creating havoc in Nicaragua, what do you suggest for our government to do vis-a-vis Russia with regards to the situation in Nicaragua? Ambassador Kozak, if you can.
Thank you for that question, sir. I'd say that I wouldn't characterize our relationship with Russia as hunky-dory. We've got more sanctions and pressure on them now than we've had in a long time. Unfortunately, the relationship between Russia and the Ortegas goes back to the times we were talking about.
But I would say our relationship
late 1970s.
I would say our relationship with Russia right now is better than with NATO, given what transpired in the last couple of days.
I'm not going to characterize broad relationships, but I would say with respect to Nicaragua and Russia, I happened to be in Nicaragua talking to the Ortegas when that first report of the sale of the tanks came up and asked him about it. He was evasive, in fact, almost lied, saying, oh no, they were just armored vehicles. For the life of me, I can't figure out what he's going to do with $80 million worth of T-72 tanks. They aren't very good at battling your own people in the streets, and he doesn't have any enemies with tanks. But the thing that's really hurting that regime right now is what he's doing to himself. They have effectively destroyed the economy much better than anything we could have done. So I think we want to keep warning Russia against adventurism in this region, just as we are against some of their bad activities in eastern Ukraine, Croatia, or Crimea, and in Georgia. You know, that's not going to be the solution to the problem in Nicaragua. The solution to the problem there is for the Ortegas to step down and get out of the way and let the country get on with with its future. But it is unfortunately a long-standing problem of the Russians providing support to these kinds of regimes. I think it's not only founded, in the old days it was founded somewhat in ideology. Now it's founded heavily in just anti-Americanism and corruption. These are corrupt oligarchs on both sides, and it's no good for anybody else. Thank you, sir.
One last quick question is, the Congress appropriated $10 million in development assistance to Nicaragua for fiscal year 2018, although the White House requested zero funding. And in your opinion, Mr. Trujillo, what kind of resources are needed on the ground there to help promote democracy? Are there any specific programs, initiatives that could be funded? And do you have an idea, a ballpark figure of what kind of monies is necessary to keep the process moving forward for these pro-democratic forces on the ground?
Well, Congressman, I think our immediate concern from the OAS perspective is ground support for the International Commission on Human Rights and technical experts that prevent human rights abuses. We know that their request initially was $1.4, $1.5 million. That request, obviously, over time, as conditions worsen, will continue to go up. That would be an immediate area in which the United States could have an influence in protecting human life. For a recommitment to democratic institutions, the OAS has worked on that in the past, but part of that is there has to be a commitment from the government to engage in the recommitment to democratic institutions. And that could range from a couple of $1 million. The OAS had a budget for $30 million. It could go up into the hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on how much commitment we have to rebuilding a democratic institution, an electoral institution, an independent judiciary. So it could be extensive, it could be exhaustive, but I think the one thing we have to focus on is if the government lacks the willingness to negotiate and to cooperate and to rebuild the democratic institutions, no amount of money will be necessary, will be sufficient.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I guess it gives new meaning to the old saying, a chicken in every pot and a tank in every garage. I want to turn to my good friend, the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman.
Castro.
The situation in Nicaragua is dire, and I appreciate the President and the administration's actions in designating certain individuals in Nicaragua complicit in violence against civilians under the Global Magnitsky Act. And in the past weeks, hundreds of civilians have been killed by the government of Daniel Ortega. Elections are scheduled for 2021, and President Ortega has denied early elections. But 2021 is a long time away, and Nicaraguans now exist in a very hostile political environment. Are you pressuring the Nicaraguan government to hold elections earlier than scheduled?
Yes, sir. That's, I think, as we've all testified, that's what we've been calling for. We're standing with the call of the Nicaraguan people for early elections, as that seems to be the only available option for solving the crisis. Nobody is going to be able to reconcile with the regime in power, and so it's really important for them to get out of the way and let the country make a future for itself. But you know, it's how do you make that happen mechanically? How do you put enough pressure on the family, basically, to make that choice and get out of the way?
Let me ask you, what American businesses are very active in Nicaragua? Which ones come to mind?
It's been a while, but I think Walmart is there. Cargill, Walmart. Well, I mean, Walmart was building a place to sell their products.
Sure.
But again, it's not. I don't know that that there's anything we need to do about that. The deterrent now on anyone investing anything in that place is the behavior of the government. They're doing a dandy job of creating sanctions against themselves. But and that's actually the increasing pressure on them. The people in the streets is a huge pressure that is being generated by Nicaraguan people themselves. The flight of capital out of the country, the lack of investment is a direct reaction to the behavior of the government. And you know, we're a supporting player in this, and as we've all discussed, trying to take the measures that we can with the tools you've given us. And just to follow up, I would say, why have we not used Global Magnitsky before? Well, it came into force about a year ago, and it is a tremendous tool because it allows us to go after corrupt and human rights abusing officials in other countries without imposing sanctions on the entire country. We're able to be much more targeted, so we really appreciate that.
And let me ask a question about OAS. As you know, there's been widespread condemnation in the Americas of our government's policy of separating young children from their parents, including at OAS. And how is this affecting our ability to deal through OAS on these other issues like Nicaragua?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. We did host a hearing on the border issue, on the separation of families, and obviously it was a unique issue that was addressed at that one particular hearing. Since then, there's been absolutely no pushback. I think we've realigned with our allies in focusing on the issues that all of us are concerned about in the Western Hemisphere, mainly the deteriorating situation in Nicaragua, also the continuing deteriorating situation in Venezuela. I've personally had multiple meetings with a host of different OAS member states, a lot of countries we've traditionally aligned with, and we're continuing in a very good working relationship.
All right, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Kozak and Trujillo and Ms. Feinstein for being here with us to talk about the instability in Nicaragua, which has been very alarming to us and our constituents. I am quite a fan of the Global Magnitsky Act and want to encourage you to continue to use that, to the extent that we can in other regions too, including Guatemala. Some of these very corrupt individuals, specifically members of Congress, need to know that they just can't come to the U.S. to visit Disneyland when they're treating their people so badly. I want to talk to you about TPS. I want to talk to you about the ongoing unrest, and the State Department has told some of U.S. government employees and their families to leave Nicaragua, and are now telling U.S. citizens to reconsider their travel into Nicaragua. So are you also looking at maybe getting the Trump administration to reevaluate the temporary protected status and that is requiring some 5,300 Nicaraguans to return by January 5th of 2019? Has there been any conversations around that issue?
I have not been part, but my bureau would not normally be part of TPS.
But as you are assessing the situation down there, I'm hoping that there would be some common sense communication between, the right hand and the left hand to advise the White House that maybe this is a policy that we should revisit to send people back to a country that is in such disarray and civil unrest. I think
we can certainly carry your recommendation back. I would make the distinction, though, that when we draw down the staff in embassies, it's largely because you're trying to. The embassy is a particular target.
I understand that.
It's not just because of generalized violence in the society. It's that it's a very particular target, and we're trying to narrow the size of the target for the bad guys to get at. So
I understand that, and your safety.
But we will happily take your recommendation.
Thank you, and just for the record, your safety is very important to me also.
Yes.
Let's talk about the region and the impact that this instability in Nicaragua is maybe having in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras that are already having their own issues. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are you seeing? Are you seeing folks crossing the border into these countries?
Yeah, my sense is we haven't seen a huge outflow at this point. Nicaraguans tend to migrate more to Costa Rica than to the other places.
How can we engage our partners there? Chile, Costa Rica, some of our more affluent partners to help mitigate this situation there?
Well, I think, and I'll turn to my colleague, and certainly in the OAS, they're being engaged and engaged bilaterally. I mean, one of the things that is important, though, that you alluded to in your question is, up until recently, Nicaragua was sort of the island of stability, and it was the other countries around. But it was a false stability, and we did see this coming, not the the flashpoint that set off the latest violence, but you could just see this building up over years, that the more the Ortegas have squashed out any kind of political alternatives to themselves, the more they've even split their own movement. They've pressed the fact that she was made the vice president over the objections of, I think, most of the Sandinista party is pretty apparent. So they were creating this powder keg all along. It finally got lit off with the Social Security protests, but it is concerning because we've had enough trouble with the countries that have had instability because of gang violence and narco traffickers and so on.
Thank you.
And now you've got this to boot.
Mr. Trujillo.
As far as the migration issue, Congresswoman, in the OAS context, it hasn't really come up. I think the one thing we do see in Costa Rica is Nicaraguans who have some sort of legal recognition, trying to adjust that recognition or trying to extend that recognition. But from a migration issue of Nicaraguans leaving Nicaragua and either heading north or heading south.
China, can I ask, I'm sorry, I only have 15 seconds. China, what are you seeing? We've talked about Russia, but is China also, what are their activities there in Nicaragua? And are we concerned?
I haven't seen any from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shamit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and had two hearings going on here at the same time, so I apologize for being a little bit late. If I would ask some of the questions that have already been asked for that, I apologize. Although I don't serve on the subcommittee, I'm very interested in the deteriorating situation in Nicaragua and have been on the Foreign Affairs Committee for 22 years now and have chaired the Middle East and the Asia Committee, but not this one. Over years of corruption and illegal undemocratic behavior, the murderer, Daniel Ortega, has consolidated his power and uprooted democracy in Nicaragua. Since the latest crisis began in April, the situation in Nicaragua has pretty much gone off the cliff, from what I understand. The Ortega regime has resorted to extreme and disproportionate force to attack protesters, many of them women. This includes gangs of pro-government Sandinista thugs used to terrorize and kill innocent people. Even Nicaraguan bishops were attacked recently. So far, approximately, my understanding is approximately 300 people have been killed and anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 or more injured. We must not let this crisis create a trend in Latin America by allowing Nicaragua to follow the path of authoritarian governments like Cuba and Venezuela who continue to squander their resources and oppress their own people. Lastly, as a co-sponsor of H.R. 981, I want to thank Chairman Cook for his leadership and for holding a markup for the resolution. I support that passage of that legislation, and I've been contacted by some folks back in my district who have family in Nicaragua and have been on the phone with them, multiple times, sometimes daily, over the week, quite a lot, and religious folks in my district who support the folks who have family down there and have seen what's going on firsthand. And so my question would be initially, and again, having not had the benefit of heard everything that you already said about this, but what is the best thing that our government can do in working with our folks on the ground there to protect both American citizens that are there, their families? What influence, if any, do we have with the Ortega government? What's happening that I can take back to my constituents to let them know that we're doing everything possible to help those folks who really need our help right now? So.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Just to let you know, in terms of what you can take back to your constituents with regard to what the U.S. government is doing on behalf of the Nicaraguan people, There are several, because USAID, and thanks to the generosity of this Congress and this committee in particular, we have been a longstanding presence in Nicaragua, working side by side, shoulder to shoulder with civil society there, which is playing an absolutely critical role in getting out the narrative about what is going on, the horrific atrocities that you've referenced in your testimony. And we think it's important that a light is shown on that for the people of Nicaragua to take away from the distorted narrative that the government is putting forward, as well as to shine a light on it in the international community to document the human rights violations that are going on so that they can be prosecuted at some point in time. So we are undertaking a series of interventions, as I said, related to human rights, also independent media, legal assistance to victims and their families who are being brutally attacked at this point in time, and also digital security as the government perpetrates a very systematic campaign to try to delegitimize civil society actors through malign information that's placed online, through pulling down their accounts on Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. We're providing support to those actors as well, and I defer to my colleagues to speak to American citizens.
Thank you. I'd welcome any comments by the other gentleman.
Thank you,
Mr. Ambassador.
And I would just add, with respect to American citizens, I would advise your constituents stay in close touch with the embassy. There's a consular warden system, so the embassy is constantly trying to monitor, you know, what are the danger zones, what are the trip points, and so on, and warn people against that. So having that good communication. Also, there's like a phone tree that they set up, and you want to be sure that if somebody does get in trouble, that gets back quickly to the embassy. Yes, we have some influence with them. I think if they were rational actors, they would understand that messing with Americans would not be healthy, but you know, they're not all rational actors. So it's something people should be very, very careful, pay very close attention to the warnings and the advice that the embassy provides them. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, some of it is, you know, they're American citizens who have family on the ground that are not American citizens. So it's not only the American citizens that I'm concerned about or my constituents are, but it's the Venezuelans who are not necessarily citizens but have American connections. And being America, we care about not just Americans but others who are, people who aren't causing the problems here, which is obviously people outside the Ortega government. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me ask questions, even though I'm not on the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize Elena Ross-Layton for questions, comments, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to excellent panelists. Ambassador, is it time we revisit Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA? And Ambassador Trujillo, you were recently in Nicaragua where you met with Ortega. How will you ensure that Ortega meets the commitments made on the SEND dialogue? And please tell us more about the meeting and how it went. Ambassador Kozak.
Well, I would say we should be looking at, you know, all the different points of pressure. But as I indicated earlier, on anything on the economic side, they're doing such a good job of harming themselves that, you know, they almost don't need any help from us. And you need to, you know, look beyond the Ortegas too, as to what you want to see for the country in the future. But again, good thought to take a look at that point of pressure, as well as the many others that we have, and see what we can do. Again, always in the role of we're the supporting players. We're trying to back the play of the people of Nicaragua themselves, and not to have an agenda of our own. Thank you.
Ambassador Trujillo.
Thank you, Congresswoman. In my meeting, I think the U.S. message is that the violence must stop immediately. I think before there's any dialogue, before there's any conversation, you can't have a weekend in which 20, 30, 40 people perish based on acts of violence perpetrated by the government. So our message was very clear that the violence must stop immediately. And I think furthermore, there is a dialogue process, but the dialogue has to be kept in earnest. And what I mean by that is that people sit down, but there's no commitment to really advance an agenda. And in order for an agenda to advance that leads to a commitment to democracy for the government, there should be some sort of written game plan that's executed and which both parties commit to. So part of our conversation was, besides stopping the violence and committing to protect the citizens, which is a fundamental duty of government, There should also be a written game plan in which all the concerns from all sides are addressed. Both parties are bound by that agreement, mediated by the church, and that agreement is further carried out, which was at first initially well received. Unfortunately, in the last 2.5 weeks, we have not had a written response as to the agreement that would create the conditions for real, earnest dialogue. And I think one thing that further deteriorated the dialogue is when you invite the church to be the mediators of the dialogue and then you proceed to attack them, beat them, torture them, humiliate them, it makes it very difficult for them to continue to want to participate.
Thank you, Ambassador Trujillo, and keep encouraging the OAS to do the right thing in Nicaragua. They've acted on Venezuela, but very poor when it comes to the horrific attacks on democracy in Nicaragua. Their silence is deafening. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I think that's changed. So the June 30th, we passed our first resolution to capture the space. And part of the problem at the OAS is if it's a difficult conversation, we always default to the path of least resistance, which is doing absolutely nothing. So just capturing the space was very important to have the conversation as to Nicaragua. Since then, we've had a report from the Commission, International Commission on Human Rights, which addressed and held the government responsible for the violation of human rights. We had a follow-up hearing yesterday as to all the violations in which the majority of the larger population countries in the Western Hemisphere opined condemning the government for the violations of human rights, which is a very important step for people to recognize that Ortega and Murillo are responsible for the crimes against humanity that are currently taking place. And our next step is to pass a resolution condemning the violence and calling for free, fair, and early elections. That's the next process that we're currently working on. But I think just creating a space in which the Nicaraguan people know that not only the United States, but the international community is supporting their cause, and it's keeping account of the violators of human rights. And one day we will seek justice for all those people who violate human rights, is a very, very important message to send not only to the government, but a lot of the government actors who are still deciding which side to pick.
Ms. Torres, one more question.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to do the follow-up on the Chinese investment in Nicaragua, specifically related to the canal that they had envisioned, and there was an agreement that was made. Although I understand that there is no in that agreement, there's no requirement to actually have identified funding for it. It might not be the Chinese government, but there is a Chinese billionaire, people with a lot of money that are investing in this project. What are you seeing there?
Congresswoman, I personally, from the OAS perspective, have not seen it. I've heard the rumblings of a competing Panama Canal, but I haven't seen anything. And obviously, I was only there for less than 24 hours, so I didn't have the opportunity to see anything as specifically related to that.
My concern again is because it would require a relocation of many villages and many people within the area that has been identified around the lakes and rivers. They have been identified for the purpose of building this canal. You know, this is the time to take advantage of moving those people by force out of the way, right? Please continue to look out for those issues and as we move forward. Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity again.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of quick questions, and I'm going to apologize in advance for I was speeding up on the OAS, but very, very concerned about the influence of Venezuela on the OAS and some of the nations that are in close proximity in the Caribbean. In terms of voting power, each one of them has one vote. And I think it's not a secret that some of the rebates for oil and things like that influence the voting patterns of certain states, which obviously affects how the OAS might vote on Venezuela, but also Nicaragua. It becomes kind of a calculus problem in that each state has one vote, and I've always thought the OAS had a very, very strong influence, and I see this influence being diluted by those things that are happening. Ambassador, would you like to comment on that, or am I delusional?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, Chairman. I think that was the case for many, many years until recently. The last OAS General Assembly, the United States was able to lead a resolution on Venezuela that passed 19-4 with a few abstentions. This is the first time in recent history that we're able to advance a resolution that condemns the government and that doesn't recognize the elections, the sham elections that just took place in Venezuela. I thought that was an important turning point in the U.S. OAS leadership in the organization and the ability of the organization to stay relevant and get things done. But I think furthermore, looking forward, we have to create an alternative, not a financial alternative or a competing petrochemical program, but why is the U.S. a better alternative than China, than Russia, than Venezuela for the U.S. interests? And I think it's incumbent upon all sectors of the U.S. government to really advocate on why our partnership is much more important to a lot of these countries and some of the partnerships that they have sought. To that end, we've tried to work with some of the other partners in creating energy alternatives, plugging them into the right people, whether it's OPEC, whether it's energy, whether it's Treasury, and finding ways in which we could help advance their personal interests and help advance their lack of reliance or less reliance on some of these foreign actors. But it is a very challenging environment, and the most challenging thing is a country with 60 or 80,000 people has the same exact vote as a state as the United States of America. A country that puts in tens of thousands of dollars has the same vote as a country who puts in tens of millions. It's a very challenging environment. Obviously, we're trying to overcome those challenges as best we can. But I think it's also important on Congress to stay attuned as to who some of these countries are. Because they oftentimes come and they'll vote one way in the OAS, and they'll come here to Congress and ask for unlimited resources and unlimited projects, and sometimes there's not enough coordination and not enough communication in which we all know that they have to help advance the U.S. taxpayer and the American interests.
Thank you. The other thing I just wanted to throw open, and it goes back to many, many years ago when you had a situation in the communist government in Poland. And there was an individual, a cardinal, who went on to Rome. I think we all know the history, and I think he was the one that the communist regime at the time feared most for good reason. And I look at the role of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. I know it's a very, very strong influence, and I'm just wondering, as a variable, I think that I'm not going to preach to the Ortega, but I think they're when they turn against the Catholic Church, strange things might happen. Any comment on that viewpoint? I say my prayers. I have to. I'm in Congress, but I know a lot of people pray, and so.
I think, Chairman, that was a turning point, at least in the OAS. The majority of the countries are Roman Catholic, predominantly Roman Catholic, and just the affinity towards the clergy in general and the government's lack of respect towards the clergy they invited into the dialogue really sent shockwaves across the organization. I think anytime the government engages in violent acts against a clergy that's just trying to be a peaceful mediator for college students and people protesting for freedom and democracy, it's very, very difficult to overcome. And I think going forward, the credibility of the government as an institution is always going to be second to that of the church, especially in Nicaragua. And it's going to be very, very difficult for them to navigate that water.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our witnesses for speaking today. I want to thank the members. You know, they're not here anymore. They're tired of listening to me. But we actually had a great turnout, considering there's multiple meetings and things going on, because they know how important this is. And to our two visitors that have gone through so much, once again, I underscore your courage for being here, your inspirations. This is a tough, tough, tough issue. But obviously, I think you see the bipartisan interest in this. We're all concerned, and not just but the humanitarian aspects of it and what goes on, and you have to live with it all the time. So, great panel. I thought we had a great discussion, and thank you for being here. So, I have to do pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee would be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 business days to allow statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. There being no further business, the subcommittee is adjourned. Now, where do I go? Thank you again. We're not done yet for anybody who wants to hang around. Yes, we are. It's going to be real quick. All right.
Do it here and I'm sorry. No, I'm just, in other words, we can make the change at a minute. That's totally fine. That's easier. Totally fine. We wanted to make a slight amendment because there's a statement that's a little bit inaccurate, but we can just do it at the full committee, so let's just we'll let it go smoothly now and then change the word ignore to reform a couple weeks down the road.
Is that my error? Did I say something I shouldn't?
No, everything's great. You guys are doing great.
Okay.
Everything's going ahead as planned. More sticky notes.
Oh, thank you. The subcommittee will come to order pursuant to notice. We meet today to mark up House Resolution 981, a bipartisan measure condemning the violence committed by the government of Nicaragua against its own citizens. Without objection, the resolution is considered read and open for amendment at any point, and all members may have 5 days to submit statements and materials for the records. I now recognize myself to speak on this measure. We have just concluded a subcommittee hearing on the crisis in Nicaragua with administration officials, and we meet now to consider House Resolution 981 to publicly condemn the Ortega regime's violent oppression and human rights violations against the Nicaraguan people. I am an original co-sponsor of this resolution, and I want to applaud the leadership of Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton and the bipartisan efforts of this subcommittee to move this resolution forward. I have heard from many Nicaraguans in the United States who are concerned about the crisis in Nicaragua and the nearly 300 people who have died since the unrest broke out in April. The continued violence and oppression by the Ortega regime is reprehensible. Unfortunately, Daniel Ortega and his wife, Rosemary Murillo, have chosen to inflict greater oppression rather than work through dialogue to achieve a peaceful resolution to this crisis. On Sunday, 38 people were killed, making it the deadliest day in Nicaragua since the protests began. The United States will not stand idly by while the Ortega regime continues to oppress its people with impunity. This resolution condemns the Ortega regime's violence, supports the Nicaraguan people in their pursuit of democracy, and calls for more U.S. sanctions. I also believe the United States should work more closely with the other democratic partners in the Organization of American States, European Union, Canada, and the Lima Group to work towards a peaceful resolution of the crisis. With that, I will now recognize the ranking member for his comments on the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I support this resolution, and I will be speaking more on this resolution when we have the full committee.
Thank you, sir. Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the resolution? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I support the resolution condemning the violence and persecution and intimidation by the Ortega government in Nicaragua. Let it be known to all that the United States will stand up to left-wing and right-wing dictators who oppress their people, deny people human rights, and stifle democracy. And I believe this resolution is a condemnation of those actions by the Ortega government. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Any other members wanting to speak? Are there any amendments? Hearing no further recognition or request for recognition, the chair moves that the subcommittee favorably report the resolution to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is approved, and House Resolution 981 is reported favorably to the full committee. With that, no more business. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.